be talking today and continuing on a topic of all experience is a story. And in reflective meditation, we have a high value on speaking from our experience and to try to keep our speech as close to the experience in meditation as possible. And that's the way we train ourselves to stay close to our experience. And we don't want to go so far so that we lose the connection to that experience, to that story. Even when we imagine or have daydreams or fantasies, we then look back at them to see what our intentions are, what our motivations, what matters to us in some of these stories that we're working with. So in my thinking this morning, and this isn't new, but that stories need reflection. And stories are using speech. And speech is a big deal in Buddhism. It's spoke on the Eightfold Path to use right speech and honest speech, self-honest speech, skillful speech, supportive speech, timely speech, when to speak. And it's not always so clear. When we're not speaking up, when we stay silent for too long, stories can be erased. And that's very painful. It's very painful for individuals. It's very painful for societies, for cultures whose stories don't get told. Because really, if you're not languaging the story and becoming aware of it, it becomes invisible. You become invisible. And you become invisible to yourself and to others. And it's really a loss of awareness, which is what our practice is about, is to become more aware. It's really going in the opposite direction. And it's also easy to forget history when we don't look at stories and we reflect upon them. And we lose the chance to change the story, which is so important in our world, is to be able to affect some change in these stories and refine them and trade up, as we talked about yesterday. So I was reflecting on this as I was writing, and I thought, well, invisibility is not always so bad. Harriet the Spy, she wrote in invisible ink in her book, and Harry Potter had an invisibility cloak. And, I always found something intriguing in that kind of invisibility. And more on point, Sally Tisdale, she's a Buddhist writer. She says that creative work and spiritual practice both cultivate a relationship to the invisible. We think about the invisible, we sit with the invisible, yet words are all we have, most of the time, to explain ourselves and connect with others. And that those words bring kind of they come from the invisible and bring some sense of order to the chaos and confusion in our lives. So there is this connection between the invisible and our stories. Yet I still want to make the point that there's subtle and not so subtle ways that we get the message to silence story in Buddha Dharma. So the first place and first example is in Vipassana, which is an insight tradition. It's one of the few meditation traditions that stories don't have a positive valence. It's really not something that's looked at as to cultivate. It's looked at to get rid of. And the one place we see this is in meditation retreats, which are done in noble silence. So the silence is a perfect container for stories. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they don't want stories to be a part of it. Because I remember being on a Goenka retreat, which is another Vipassana tradition, and I wasn't able to speak the whole time, look at anybody. And what ended up happening was I made so many stories up about people's feet and shoes because I just was looking down all the time. So my meditation was filled with the shoes that people were wearing, trying to put them on whose feet and find the right shoes. So I do understand not wanting to go into other stories, but really it wasn't that useful for me to spend that much time with people's shoes. Um, but because of that, we changed things a little bit. So on retreats, we still have noble silence, but we have groups for people to talk about their experience and their stories of their meditation, and then check them out a little bit, hear other people, what's going on. So there's a kind of normalizing within a silence, like you go in and out and in and out. And by the way, we do have a few places open for our retreat, our online retreat, at the end of April. Just a few more people would be lovely. Um, but we found this going back and forth to be necessary. So we're able to reflect upon this and make a change within the way we do retreats. But it's still not a popular stance. And we write in our book, after all, everyone knows you should not allow stories in meditation. I mean, I hear this from people who don't even know about the Vipassana tradition, but the the um, the assumption is that that's daydreaming or that's monkey mind, and that's not to be trusted. But we really haven't found this to be true, and we really like monkeys. I like telling people that. Nelly got to see a few in Costa Rica, and I may do so in July when I'm in Costa Rica too. But anyway, I want to jump from that, from the Vipassana tradition to the larger tradition, the larger Buddhist tradition, and go to where the silence is very painful. And this is often in any type of abuse that happens with teachers. And this happens because there is a kind of silence within the community, a silence that's taken from this meditation and really transferred into the way people interact with each other. And survivors' stories get silenced. They're not allowed to be heard within the Buddhist teachings. And I've studied a lot of this, and I'm part of a board for Heartwood. And Carol Murchison is one of the lawyers that has taken on many cases. And unfortunately, there are many cases in the Buddhist tradition where this is still happening, because she's taken them on because the legal system has actually found a way for those voices to be heard, for women to come forward and talk about what happened to them. And that, really in very simple language, is that a rape within a religious tradition is not a gift. It's not a spiritual teaching. And their voices have to be heard and have to be realized, that have to be, I'm sorry, that give them the power to actually speak this to people who will listen and take some accountability. And it's an empowering process for people who have gone through trauma within Buddhist systems. One thing that Carol notes, which is interesting in my sense of this, is that often in a civil case, non-disclosures are offered for the women. And sometimes they take them because it's too hard to keep going through the process again and again of speaking up. But that often it's not good for society, because then people still don't know what's happening, and that this goes under again into another carpet of silence. And I bring it into our community not because we're dealing with it directly, but because it's a part of the larger system that we inherit and we're living in. Um, so another little bit less painful topic, but it still can be, is when cultures are erased from Buddhist practices. And Tommy Orange is an American novelist, a writer from Oakland, California, and wrote a book. Susan McIntosh sent me a quote of his from his new book called Wandering Stars. It's now on my list. But he says it's just as important for you to hear yourself speak your stories as it is for others to hear you speak them. And when I read the quote, I just thought, oh, Tommy, I wish you could come to our meditation group. And I really do, extend the invitation, because as I talked about before, I really love hearing the values of our practice within the values of other cultures and other voices, and that this is a really important um, um, uh, intermixing of traditions and welcoming of other traditions into our Buddhist practice of reflective meditation. So we encourage you to talk about your stories, and we think that this is right within the tradition of right speech. Am I going to change the translation of right speech to right storying? No, I don't think so. But I really am bringing in an emphasis on the thread that storytelling and stories don't get lost within the tradition, so that it becomes part of the larger Buddhist conversation, and that it's something that is not invisible. So I'll end my talk here.